Welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. On June the 8th of 1949, George Orwell published 1984. Nearly 8 decades later, the book is still unpleasantly fresh. It's a diagnosis that was given before our society was even willing to admit it's sick, and frankly, everything that he said, or most of what he said, has turned out to be true. George Orwell was born Eric Arthur Blair in 1903. He served in the Indian Imperial Force in Burma, lived among workers and the poor. He fought with anti-Stalinist forces in the Spanish Civil War. He worked for the BBC during the Second World War, and finally, he wrote his last novel with seriously ill tuberculosis. 1984, therefore, came from a man who had seen imperial authority, fanaticism, bureaucracy, and revolutionary betrayal. And he was enduring bodily suffering. And so he wrote from inside that suffering instead of without. In his essay, Why I Write, Orwell said every line of serious work he had written since 1936 was written against totalitarianism. He also explained that he wrote because there's some lie I want to expose. That gives all of us the central key to 1984. Orwell was not interested in pessimism. He wanted to compel civilized people to examine the lies that we are tolerating, because those lies can make cowardice a social order. The story itself of 1984, painfully simple. Winston Smith lives in Oceania under Big Brother. He works at the Ministry of Truth rewriting old records. He keeps a forbidden diary, he's not allowed to keep it, and he has an illicit relationship with Julia. He hopes for rebellion through someone named O'Brien, and he finally discovers that the regime doesn't merely want obedience from individuals, it wants possession of their intellect, of their memory, of their soul. The genius of the novel is in its understanding that tyranny doesn't begin by announcing itself as tyranny with an army. It first teaches a people to surrender things like their language, their history, their privacy, their family loyalties, even their sexual integrity, their intellectual discipline, and eventually the basic confidence that objective truth does exist beyond political power. Newspeak narrows language in the Orwellian world so that thought itself becomes harder. Doublethink then trains the citizen to accept contradictions by force of habit. And then the 2-minute hate gives their rage an official social liturgy, so to speak. And then Big Brother replaces biological and familial fatherhood with government surveillance. And then the party rewrites the past. So thoroughly, in fact, that memory of the past becomes contraband. And so Winston's final defeat comes when torture makes him love the very face that ruined him. That's actually why the word Orwellian exists. Our culture needs a special adjective for the political sin of using language to disguise progressivist coercion. It's frankly amusing in the most depressing sense. Every institution accused of Orwellian behavior immediately answers with a public relations statement that's carefully written by people who've clearly never read the novel. George Orwell was prophetic. He understood that a society can lose liberty through fear, comfort, amusement, or resentment, and that the slow moral laziness of citizens who assume that freedom can maintain itself is going to catch up with them. The problem is ordered liberty is not some kind of houseplant that we can water every so often. It is a privilege that needs to be fought for. And so Orwell's warnings against us have aged well. Modern man now lives under conditions that makes surveillance, government surveillance, ordinary, especially by means of the digital world. We engage in public shaming by means of cancel culture constantly. Our speech is policed by informal mobs that one cannot help but feel has some kind of a connection to particular political narratives and political parties. Our memory is outsourced to screens. We monetize our outrage on social media. Loneliness, individual isolation, we've normalized it. Our political identity, we treat it with a religious seriousness that unfortunately at one point the entire nation reserved for God and God alone. To be precise, Orwell didn't predict every device, every platform. He couldn't have foresawn Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or AI as it exists today. But he was still prophetic, because it's the moral lessons behind 1984 that's more crucial than fortune-telling. He saw the deeper pattern that technology joined to disordered power will eventually make domination easier, because it will not be the domination of whole societies but individuals. Rulers, in that sense, will no longer use prisons. They will individually dominate citizens and train them to supervise themselves, train them to toe the line themselves. The first fulfilled warning in the book: corruption of language. Look at this now. The unborn child now becomes a product of conception, or a clump of cells. Euthanasia is now death with dignity, suicide, assisted suicide. Censorship, cancel culture, content moderation as it's called today, propaganda, now it's called messaging. Mutilation becomes healthcare. Moral sanity has become hate. I mean, the human mind, the modern human mind in the West especially, has already marched more than halfway into Orwell's Ministry of Truth. And unfortunately, we volunteered ourselves in doing so. The second fulfilled warning: destruction of memory. A people with no sense of historical discipline can be made to believe almost anything, because their minds are so open that their brains will fall out. That's why Winston, in the novel, his job matters so much. The party knows that whoever controls the record controls the social imagination for the future. The third fulfilled warning is the political management of hatred. The 2 minutes hate has become a daily habit for millions. The moment we start scrolling social media as soon as we awake, we begin each morning by finding an enemy on the screen and feeding into that outrage. And we end each evening feeling morally accomplished because we've taken out our outrage publicly, and we've fed into particular algorithms in doing so. The fourth fulfilled warning: the replacement of truth by power. O'Brien's nightmare lesson to Winston is that the party seeks power for its own sake. That's the inevitable end of every politics that's severed from natural law, divine judgment, and the moral structure of the created order. The founders of the United States actually understood this well. James Madison wrote in Federalist 51, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." John Adams warned that the Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. I know many of you have heard me quote these two lines time and time again, but what this precisely means is that Republican liberty, which means we don't have a mass democracy the way we think of it. It actually isn't. It's a republic, if we can keep it. It presumes virtue and a division and delineation of powers at different levels. It doesn't produce virtue automatically. The Enlightenment, at its best, also understood that reason requires discipline, age-old discipline. John Locke had a particular account of natural rights. He still depended on some kind of an objective moral order that precedes the government. It's a priori to the government. Montesquieu, he argued in The Spirit of the Laws that political liberty requires institutions that are arranged against things like abuse. So our present arrogance right now looks especially childish because we want maximum freedom, but we don't want the formation and the discipline of virtue and intellect necessary. And then we act stunned when our appetites turn against us. Modern Catholics, we have an obligation to read 1984 with our families and to talk about it. I cannot stress that enough. The Catholic mind actually has the imagination to understand history in its right lens. The Catholic mind knows that truth is not manufactured by the state. History is not mere clay in the hands of an ideologue. History is ultimately subject to the Lord of the universe, through whom we get the reality of salvation history, which is the only lens to view all of human history. The Church teaches us that man has a duty to seek the truth and then to adhere to it once it is known. Dignitatis Humanae, for example, it grounds our religious freedom in the dignity of the human person, not in state permission. And that's precisely why, actually, the opposite is true in Big Brother's world. Dignity there, in 1984, exists as a slogan that is useful to the powerful party. The Catechism teaches us that social communication must serve truth within justice and charity, and that the content of communication must be true and complete within moral limits, which sounds quaint because our age now has curated fragments that regularly masquerade as knowledge with some kind of smug confidence. And so here's my exhortation to all of us. Be careful with the truths that we have been given. Be stewards of the liberty we've been given. And most of all, read 1984. And let's learn these lessons and reclaim what virtuous liberty in a society ought to look like. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.